Life Audio.
Hi, my name is Jeff King. I'm the president of persecution.org and one of the world's leading experts on religious freedom. I focus on spiritual growth, religious freedom, and persecution around the globe. You're listening to Faith Under Fire. Hey, well, welcome back to Faith Under Fire. I'm Jeff King, the president of International Christian Concern, persecution.org on the web. Let's see, Faith Under Fire is where we deepen, define, and defend your faith. And today we are going to be talking to Jennifer Slattery again. Jennifer, welcome, and tell people who you are and where they can find you.
Yeah, so I'm a writer, speaker, a podcast host, and really if you just look for Jennifer Slattery online and it'll take you to my website, and then you can find my books and my links and all the fun stuff.
That's great. On this second show, we already did one show, but we're going to do this one, and we're going to focus on evangelism, which is a topic that's near and dear to your heart as well as mine. And let's start with kind of your background, your history, and just wrap it around evangelism.
Yeah. So I wasn't raised in a Christian home. I would call myself a first generation, I guess, Christian. And in fact, my aunts and uncles are addicts, new age, kind of whatever philosophy I think most benefits them in the moment. And I was first introduced to Christ actually at a neighborhood Good News Bible Club. And this was I lived in a trailer park in a really small timber town in Oregon. And I still remember this lady's name. Her name is Dorothy. She's probably going to be the first person I meet outside of Jesus when I get to heaven. But she opened her door to a bunch of rowdy kids from the neighborhood. And I'm sure she taught us a bunch of stuff. The only thing I remember is her popcorn and her. And the day that she told me that Jesus loved me and died for me. And that it hit really deep. And I was young, and I really believe that it sank so deep in my soul that God was protecting me, spiritually protecting me, even though I went through a lot of stuff growing up, but he remained with me. And so that's a big part of why, I feel like I had a very clear, so we moved from there and we often lived next door to pastors and that sort of thing. And so I felt like my childhood, I had a really clear picture between light and dark, and I had no misgivings. Darkness to me, it was really dark, and light was really light. And so and God He did so much in my life, even because I rebelled as a teenager, and like I shared last episode, I did end up homeless for a season. Yeah. And he still was faithful, and he pulled me out, and I know what, I can look at family that never turned to Christ, and I can see where their life trajectory ended. Yes. And then I can see the families that, my older sister, she has such a beautiful relationship with Christ, and I'm looking at her, I'm watching her raise her kids who are teenagers, and I'm watching her marriage. And so I have no misgivings of what life apart from Christ looks like.
And that's really motivating, and
very motivating.
Spread that message.
Yes.
And I think you told me, after your life came together and you and your husband got in a very evangelism-oriented church, and so it sounds like you're a fairly big proponent of we should be evangelizing. Is that fair?
Well, here's what I would say: if we belong to Jesus, we have the Holy Spirit residing within us. We have a drive to share Christ. We have a drive to be intimate with Christ and to tell others about him, because that's what the Holy Spirit does. Yeah. And so the question is, if we're not feeling that compulsion, what is getting in the way? There's something, it's almost like we're we know we're being deceived, we're being distracted, but there's that thing within us that's ready to spark to life. So I would say we all want to. There's just, so then the question is, what is keeping us from, and I think it's different for each person.
Yeah.
But I do think, did you ever watch was it the Screw Tape Letters? Is that the one from C.S. Lewis where the devil is like throwing all this stuff to distract people? So, I mean, that's very much our reality. But, in the last episode, we talked about anxiety and there's a lot of different causes. But if we want the type of life Jesus promised, we will live the life he planned. We cannot simultaneously not live the life he's called us to and expect to come alive the way we see the Apostle Paul did, right? When he was in a Philippian jail cell and he's praising Christ, or when he says, for me to die is gain and to live is Christ. Like, we want that type of faith and vitality, spiritual vitality. Yeah. But we want it on our terms a lot of times. And I'm saying I have a tendency to get distracted by what's in front of me, or to become overly focused on myself, which only makes me miserable. And I think that's what I want. I think that's what's going to give me fulfillment. Yeah. And then I wonder why life feels monotonous or burdensome. Right.
Yeah. And let's say, what is the biggest reason we should evangelize? I'm fishing here.
Well, I mean, I would say, first of all, there's a reason we're still on earth, right? Like, why didn't, the minute we come to salvation, why didn't God whisk us away to heaven? And I do think there's growth that needs to happen and all those things. But so we're here for a reason. And I think also, if we recognize how much this meant to Jesus, right? Not only, I mean, obviously that he was willing to suffer and die, right? But when we watch him, he wept over Jerusalem. Like, when we see his deep, and so going back to like my story, evangelism is very important to me because I know people who I love deeply who are not living with Jesus Christ. Yeah. Yeah. But one time when I was leading a parachurch women's ministry, and I really felt like God was just laying his heart on my heart. And there was one person in particular. So our family reached out to a troubled teen, and I was just broken for this teen who was just falling deeper and deeper into darkness. And I'm just wrestling with God over the state of this youth soul. And very clearly I sensed him saying to me that they, meaning the people we served, were his, and I'm not going to use the person's name, I'll give a different name, his Sarah. And so it drew this really strong, like how much I was grieving over this youth I knew personally, who I could see darkness destroy, and I could see darkness destroying her family. Yeah. And I'm like, why isn't anyone helping? Why isn't anyone doing anything? And he's like, well, we've got a whole world of Sarahs that are being destroyed. And I think also, Jeff, we, especially in today's climate, as Christ followers, we can get so stuck on the way our world is, right? Like, we don't like certain ways that politics are. We don't like the way our school systems are. We don't like the way, you name it. And yet, do we also, or we'll picket abortion clinics, that sort of thing. Do we have that same passion when it comes to reach out to our neighbor? Because if all of us were reaching out to our neighbors in love, not with it like, I'm going to beat you into becoming a Christ follower. But if we all were actively living out our mission, then we wouldn't have CPS. We wouldn't have prison systems. We wouldn't have abortion clinics. Well, maybe we will always have.
It's a theoretical statement.
Right.
Humanity's fallen. The way is broad to destruction, right?
Right.
And at the same time, so many would be rescued.
Right.
if we were faithful in this. And I want people
Right.
to pause on that. That's a great point. And we're going to get a quick word from our sponsors.
Yeah.
All right. Well, welcome back. I wanted to follow up and, I was asking you, why should Christians evangelize? And it can be answered on so many different levels. But I'm trying to think, just before Jesus left, what did he say? What did he tell?
Right.
What is that? For those who don't know what we're talking about,
Yes.
what was it?
He said, go into all nations, baptize and teach them to obey me, like make disciples of all people.
Yeah. And and it's kind of, you don't have disciples unless you evangelize, but people often pick one or the other. But he really said, go into the world, tell them about me, evangelize, and then teach them, build them up in the faith.
Right.
So why aren't churches, I mean, I don't know how long you've been a Christian, but I've been in lots of different churches. Why aren't churches doing this? Why aren't pastors doing this?
Yeah. Well, I will say, thankfully, I'm actually at a church that is very passionate about this and makes it a regular, like on their, our pastor talks about it a lot, encourages us a lot. I think one of the reasons a lot of pastors aren't doing it. And so I think they feel hypocritical if they're, and I will say, and I think there's a couple reasons for that. One, I think, and I don't want to get too much on a soapbox here, but we expect way too much from our pastors. We expect them to do every job known to man. And so they don't have the capacity really. And so I actually was part of an organization in the Omaha metro area. It's called Within Reach. And so part of when we were just kind of beginning, Barna helped us create like this whole book. It's called The State of the City, where we looked at where is God moving in the city? Where is there holes? What's keeping people from sharing their faith? It was a pretty broad book, and I'm meeting with, before we even did that, we're meeting with pastors in the area. And so we met with, I want to say I met with 10 or 20 where we're sitting down with them and saying, okay, how did you come to faith? How are you celebrating conversion stories? How are you equipping your people to share their faith? And over and over and over, I heard, I know this is important. I want to be doing this. I don't have the mental bandwidth to even come up with a long-term strategy for this. So that's one thing. And I think that's very valid, right? With what we expect from people at church, in our churches, with people on staff. And then there was also, they don't necessarily know how. And so I think a lot of times you'll have them jump from one method to another, and we get so focused on the method rather than the principles.
That's
right?
True. So true.
And then like if the method doesn't work, we also, I think, if you shoot the bar low, your people are going to tend to go lower.
That's fair.
And so in one church, this was years ago, but I led our women's ministry, and I would hear from the pastor over me constantly, well, we don't want to ask too much. We're already asking this. We're asking this. We don't want to make too many asks. And while I think that's valid, we're also asking people to share their faith is not a heavy ask, right? It's life-giving. And so I think there also needs to be a shift in perspective. Like one of the things I had to train my leaders when I led my ministry was, when we invite people to volunteer, we're not asking them to do us a favor. God doesn't need them. Our ministry doesn't need them.
That's right.
We are inviting them to growth and to life and to passion and to fulfillment. And so if we're not thinking in those evangelism, there is nothing more exciting than seeing someone walk from death to life, right?
Amen. Yes.
There's nothing more exciting and life-giving than having somebody ask you spiritual questions and seeing God draw them. And if you've ever experienced that, we know this, right? And I think sometimes we forget. But so I think some of that making the shift in our brain, we're not asking people to do anything. We're inviting them to come alive as they were created to be.
Yeah. I was really struck by a couple things you said about, especially the gathering of pastors and how they were responding. And it's like, I don't have the bandwidth. And in pastors, I always say, look, those guys have such a tough job. It's politics, and it's naturally a position that creates anxiety and fear, because if you push too hard, you're afraid you're going to be thrown out or whatever and not be accepted. And so it's just a tough job. But I find it maddening, though, because it's like, I think it reveals something. So first of all, I don't have the bandwidth, but it's just like the biggest commandment. And then it's like, what has church devolved into? What is the pastor's mindset that their job is devolved into delivering information?
Yeah.
So I'd say that, but more importantly, what you said, really, I think a lesson of what you said is they've got too much on their plate. And I think what we say is we don't wait for the pastor. He doesn't have to be doing it. You are a priest with the Lord, right? And there's nothing you need from the pastor. Go out to obey. You go out and be faithful, because the Lord has told us to do it, and it's rewarding, as you said. It's like, oh my gosh, which I was going to say for later, and we'll get into that. But oh my gosh, isn't it? So it's like you don't have to wait. Listen and obey. And we're going to talk about that and what are the lessons of how do we go about that?
Yeah.
So as you said, evangelism, one of the whys of evangelism, apart from it's commanded, is that it is so rewarding. And if people haven't seen it, it's like, oh my gosh, when you see the dead come to life, when you see the enslaved get free, and when you see the, the resurrection and them dancing and wanting to shout from the rooftops, you see the new believer wanting to shout from the rooftops, there is one who has life, and there is one who has meaning. Right. So, oh my gosh, what it does to your heart. And I don't want to say I am, I'm not an evangelism machine. So everything I'm saying can be pointed back to me, but I do evangelism. I'm looking for opportunities. So that's really just the first orientation, where you're asking the Lord, right? And you're saying, Father, I want to obey here. So first of all, give me courage, and then send people to me and open my ears. So I'm watching and I'm listening, and I'm trying to discern when he's sending somebody to me. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, and I'm a big proponent. So we are really intentional with our neighborhood, and wherever we've lived, we've considered this is our primary mission field. And so a big part, and I think sometimes we're in too much of a hurry. So in our old neighborhood, we lived there, I want to say about 10 years. It took 5 years of inviting people. So we do neighborhood socials. 5 years of inviting people, and nobody showed. And then we had once where we did like a Christmas. We did like a Christmas party, and we had 2 people show, and I had people telling me during that time, well, maybe that's not your mission field. And I'm thinking, well, they're my neighbors. That makes no sense to me. Yes. And so I think sometimes we live in a culture where it is harder a lot of times, and it's so in the neighborhood we're in now, and this is the other thing, and I'm by no means
an evangelism machine. Right.
But my husband and I have made choices to free up our time. So we sold our home, and we got a 2-bedroom condo, so that we have limited, we have one car that we share. Yeah. So what that does is it allows me and him, it allows us a lot more flexibility to where our time is a lot more available than when we have more expenses. So I would say that's one thing. But so we're in this new neighborhood, and there's something about this neighborhood here where people are a lot more open to connect. And so it's felt easier. But the other thing and it's been really simple. So I spoke to a church in about an hour from here, and it was an older generation, a lot of the members. And I'm sitting at the table kind of after we're giving this, the talk was on living as light for Christ, basically. And we're having the table talk and like, oh, I wish I could, I'm retired and I don't know. I just don't really know how to share Jesus. I'm like, just invite someone to dinner, but so it really is easy as I just make desserts. Like when we first moved in and we're in an area like our people, they're still building. We're in a condo and they're still kind of building and so when somebody new moves in, I bring them a dessert and I give them a card and it has my husband and our name and number on it. I'm like, hey, if you need anything, if you want coffee, I'm always, and so that opens the door. Right. Then a lot of times something will happen and they'll need to text us, and then we can begin. And then we normally try to be consistent and we do it like on a quarter. For us, quarterly is effective or is manageable. And we just do little neighborhood socials. And that's when, but you don't want to come off too strong. And I think sometimes because we can answer questions we don't know that they're not actually asking, right? And it takes getting to know what their needs are, to know where they're most receptive to the gospel. And that takes time. And so I think we are in such a hurry sometimes. And I think also in the last episode, I mentioned the pastor who had this sustainable missional communities. And I wanted to know, so I asked him, like, how are you doing? How are you sustaining this? And one thing he said that was really profound, he said, well, watch what you celebrate. Are you always celebrating the really big conversion stories, the big celebrations? Or are you celebrating the obedience? The long obedience. Because what happens when all we hear, so let's just say for me, in particular, when we're in that neighborhood and it's 5 years and my husband and I are getting discouraged and we're like, why should we even do that? We feel like an idiot, right? I mean, it's a little embarrassing when you have one person show up and everybody's staring at each other. Although actually those have been some of the most precious was when they're the smaller gatherings. But when I'm sitting in church and I am working really hard to reach that neighbor who maybe has been so hurt by Christians for 20 years that he's not letting me in, right? But God is still calling me to him, and I've been trying to reach him for 5 years, and I'm sitting there and I'm hearing about the person who they went and talked to the cafe barista and they shared the gospel and boom, they came to faith. I'm like, okay, I can't do this. They're the evangelist. I'm not. What I'm doing doesn't work. It's not my call. Instead of, I'm in a hard soil.
That's
and
real.
I'm showing.
Go to Japan.
And I'm showing and especially and I think we live in a very distrusting culture. And so it's hard just to get people even to open their doors or to answer their phone. And consistency. I had someone say that to me. It was about a year ago, and I hadn't even realized that I was doing this. And she's like, well, you've just always been so consistent. And I was like, oh, okay. I didn't know it made an impact. Like I was trying to be consistent with this particular individual. I want to say for 2 or 3 years. I didn't know it was making that kind of an impact all that time. So
it's great. Hey, listen, Jennifer, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to be right back. All right. Well, welcome back. Hey, a question for you. I think about this a lot. So, in my business, we deal with the persecuted, and you can imagine. So it's natural. One of the reasons people don't evangelize is they're afraid to stand out, or to be talked about, to be the object of ridicule. So Christianity is always foolishness to the Greek, right? And then especially you think of how our culture is now and what people have been fed, the hatred they've been fed, and they're reflecting that back towards Christians. So that's always there. But then think about that on steroids with the persecuted. Think about North Korea. Think about, depending on where you're at, China. So many places. It's much broader than that. But let's think about that for a minute. And what are the lessons there for the person who there's real cost for sharing their faith? So talk about that.
I almost think, and you mentioned it in last episode,
Yeah.
I think it, and I say this never having experienced that type of persecution, but I would say it's a gift in that we see Christianity explode when there is persecution, and we see it stagnate and decline when
in the
we're
West.
in when everything
where we're fat
is
and
so
happy.
right, and where the biggest persecution is someone's going to think poorly of. And I understand that's hard. I understand we all want to. We don't want to experience rejection
in the spectrum of hard around the world. Yeah, that's on the bottom.
Right. And I think when there's persecution, not only because there's a closer connection with Christ, because they're not doing it to get that little club membership card in their pocket, right? Like they know when they're stepping forward, they know exactly what it's going to cost. And so I think there's a probably more wrestling, maybe, that I think sometimes the way we present the gospel, and I don't know, I mean, I think sometimes we can give the wrong impression when we present the gospel, and people can just be like, "Oh yeah, I'm a Christian because it's in my family, or because I go to church." And whereas when you're in a place of persecution, I think they probably wrestle more before they reach that space. And I also think they rely on one another more. Like when I think about when in Acts and when the church exploded, and you'll hear a lot of pastors talk about they had everything in common. Right. Well, because they needed that. They knew that they were going to be like, they needed one another in a way that many of us in a Western context will never recognize. Like when we went on a short-term mission trip to Central America, to El Salvador. And it was so beautiful that our translator, wherever we were, like we're driving to villages, we're all over the place. And he's like, "Oh, there's a sister, there's a brother, and we had to pull over and we had to pick them up. Like, or we'd be at like a restaurant 20 minutes away from the orphanage or whatever. And again, "Oh, this is a brother, come meet a brother, come meet a sister." And they just had this close knit connection. Because they needed one another. No, they weren't under persecution, but they were in extreme poverty.
What makes let's go practical. What makes evangelism easier?
Yeah. Well, I love in the Gospels when Nathaniel when Andrew, he is talking to Nathaniel, and he's like, I think I met the Messiah. And Nathaniel's like, "Really?" I'm paraphrasing. He says, and all he said was, "Come and see. Come and see." Like he didn't argue him. He didn't feel like he had to give him all the right answers. And I think what makes it easier is, first of all, I think this is also a caution, because people can tell if we are loving them with an agenda. And if we genuinely,
feels pretty gross, by the way, right?
It does. It's very hurtful. And if we are genuinely, so yes, we invest in our neighbors because yes, I want to see them in heaven. I also genuinely care for them. And so if they decide not to come to faith in Christ, I'm still going to genuinely care for them. So I think if we focus on building a relationship, and then the other thing that happens when we build a relationship is then we begin to see those places in their soul where they're most wounded, where they're most frightened, the places where they're most receptive to the gospel, where they, and then it becomes much easier. And also we know them. And so we're watching their body language. If we genuinely care for them, and love them, we are going to be, like, I think about it in terms of with my daughter, and anytime I have to, like when she was growing up, if I would be delivering a hard truth, right? I'm very, very careful because I don't want to squish her. I don't want to shame her. I don't want to do damage. And that's why whenever, I think we see a lot on Facebook right now, a lot of arguing, which I often wonder, like, if all the time we spend arguing on Facebook, if we were to instead use that time to build a relationship with the non-believer, our world would change. Our individual world would change.
Are you especially thinking of politics and what people do?
All of it.
Oh my gosh,
all of it. Yeah. And we're losing right now. We live in COVID was a huge opportunity. First, I will say.
Yeah.
And I actually saw God use it for good and for the gospel. And right now we have people who are terrified and desperate for peace that we know only comes through Christ. And we're missing it. We're missing our opportunity because and I get that our world is chaotic and crazy, but how can we say in one breath, the gospel is the power for life?
Yes.
Jesus Christ is sovereign and loving and good.
I'm going to keep that to myself.
Huh?
I'm going to keep that to myself.
Yeah. Well, and then freak out over all these things. We're contradicting the gospel when, and I get that we have fear and anxiety, but so that's natural, that's normal. But let's pull away and deal with our fear and anxiety with Christ instead of trying to attack it in all of these external ways. And then we can come back in a place of love and say, God really is all powerful, all knowing, and all loving. Yeah. And so everything seems chaotic right now, but you know what? He's still in control.
Amen. Okay, and so we're going to keep riffing on this subject, but how do we make evangelism be easier? We got into this earlier, and I said you need to pray. You ask the Lord to send people to you. So this is on his heart, and you just mentioned something. It was in passing, but it's so important. All around us are the dead and the dying, and people are terrified of death, and they spend a lot of their life trying to be distracted. And then when the diagnosis comes or old age comes, and it's like there's no atheist in the foxhole. When they really can't avoid it, then it becomes clear how much they fear death. But that is all around us, and we're in the lifeboat, and it's like, oh my gosh. So first of all, is to say, Lord, okay, I'm here. Send them to me. I'm not sure I like it. I'm comfortable, but I'm in. I'm in to tell people about you and to say, so open my mind and speak through me all the time, where it's not even calculated, right? Because he knows how to have something come out of your mouth that will pierce their heart. And you'll have no idea. It'll pierce their heart. So you're asking to be an agent, right? And then you're asking for him to send people to you. And then for the awareness to know when it happens. And that's what I was saying. I'm not evangelism machine, but I care deeply about it. Here's one of those stories, and you're going to relate. So we were coming back on a flight from family vacation. And so worn out from the family vacation, wonderful time. But I'm like, it's like the all day traveling experience. It was overseas. And get on the plane. And I noticed pretty quickly the guy across the aisle from me is phobic about flying. This poor guy is losing it. So worst I've ever seen. I've been to 80 countries, and I'm like, worst I've ever seen. And I'm like, oh, I don't want to do anything. I want to, Lord, okay, I'm just going to ask if this is from you. Okay, all right. So got that sense, yep. All right, and I was like, hey, my friend, how you doing? Just start talking, and then quickly led into, would it be okay if I prayed for you? And yeah. He's not a Christian. He's like, yeah. Oh gosh, anything. And then he opens up to me more and more, and I'm talking to him. And I'm like, what do you think the fear is? It's a phobia. What is that? Is it fear of death? He's like, yes, absolutely. Oh my gosh. Yeah. That is real. And so prayed for him another time. So, and when I'm praying, I put my hand on his shoulder. You ask him, make sure it's appropriate. It's okay. And this went on, and then it led into explaining the gospel. Now, Jennifer, here's one of the funny things. So over Christmas, I got AirPods, and they go in your ears. And I'm on a plane, so there's lots of noise, and I've got my ears plugged. So everything I'm sharing, I don't realize my volume.
You just saved the entire plane.
So, and later on, I asked my son, I said, hey, did you hear any of that? He's like, oh, I heard all of it. And then even at the end of the flight, it's like the gal in front of him, she turns around, she says, hey, and I told him, I said, listen, all this is by design. This happened because God is wanting you. He wants to meet you, and he wants you to be free from the fear of death. And so at the end of the flight, this gal turns around, sitting right in front of him. She said, I want you to know something. Everything he just said about God's right, this is from the Lord. He wants to reach you. And this wasn't an accident. And I was like, it was just so powerful. But it all started with, I don't want to do this.
Yeah.
I'd rather not. Yeah. And a lot of times, but it's like, what I'm saying is you listen and you pray, and I do that. So, and then you recognize, so that when he sends somebody and you are his ambassador, and just reach out. It doesn't have to be perfect. Just try and love them. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a pastor once, actually my pastor now, gave a sermon on, the Phoenician woman in, I think it's Mark chapter 7, and how Jesus, first of all, he took the disciples to the Tyre and Sidon area, which would have been like us going to a crack house in Las Vegas. Like, it would have been the same level of discomfort, because Jews did not associate with Gentiles. Yeah. They thought just being in their environment could defile them. Yeah. And anyway, long story short, so Jesus she had a demonized daughter, and Jesus cast the demon out of the daughter. But part of that, she says, they have this dialogue, and Jesus said, it's not right for the master to give the food to the dogs. And she said, yes, but even the dogs take the crumbs that fall from the table. Yeah. And my pastor made a comment, and it just happened to be, Jeff, I was about to head somewhere to be with someone who was very hostile to the Christian faith. And I really wanted to have a spiritual conversation. And I'm kind of wrestling, like, what do I say? What if I say the wrong thing? What if I say, all the stuff that we can get spinning in our head. And
because it's all up to us, right?
Right. And the pastor said, all it takes is a crumb. Yeah. All it takes is a crumb of Jesus. And it was like God said to me in that moment, and you have Jesus within you, so you are bringing him into every situation. And that really freed me. It was like, okay, Jesus is with me. And we had a nice conversation. And it wasn't the spiritual but it did happen later. There was because God laid the groundwork through me just being a loving, kind presence. And here's the other thing is, you talk about when people are in end of life phases or fearful phases. And I've had numerous people that I thought were really antagonistic to my faith. But when they've gotten in like a crisis, they've said something to me like, will you pray for me because you have a direct link with God? Or, or can you pray over this situation? And it's like, okay, so my perception of your perception was off. Yeah. And the other thing I would probably say to this is, so we see the external behavior. Yeah. And we make all sorts of assumptions. And usually it's like, well, they hate us, or they hate our message, and usually they're dealing with their own shame. They're dealing with their own fear and anxiety. It usually has more to do with what's going on with them. And I had this one individual in particular where this person hates Christians, like strongly hates Christians. And anytime we would have a visit, this individual would light up social media with all these terrible things that Christians have ever done in the history of mankind. Yeah. And it grieved me. And I was speaking with my mentor, and she said, they're not fighting against you. Yeah. They're fighting God. Yeah. And I was like, okay. So it's a shift of perspective. If we think they're fighting us, then we can easily fall into like argue mode, which only pushes them further from Christ.
Right. They want to argue and fight. Yeah.
Right. But if we're like, okay, well, they're wrestling with God, and that's actually a good thing. I think we have to be concerned when they quit wrestling with God unless they surrender
Yeah.
to him. But I mean, like if they're like really apathetic about it,
That's right.
I think we need to be more concerned about that than the one who
That's fair.
is seeming riled up.
That's a great insight.
Yeah.
So keep going in this vein of just what makes evangelism easier. And I want to talk about this. This was just a recent thing for me for, I swear, it might have been 10, 20 years. I've had this on my brain. And, I tend to be kind of the mayor, I'm just always yapping and friendly. And so it grieves me a lot of times because you meet people and then, you've got to go. So I always think of this lady at Walmart, and was out in the middle of nowhere. And I was talking to her and she's telling me all about her life, which everyone does with me. And then I got to go and I don't have time. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And so one of the methods back in the day that people can do is you write out your story. Doesn't have to be brilliant. It's the story of what God did. I was this, and then I met God and I found out he was this, and then he saved me, and then I became this. That's the story. Yeah. So if you can write that out and have it printed as a little booklet, and you'd say to people, hey, listen, I wish I had more time with you. And could I leave, this is my story, could I leave this with you? No one refuses that story. Wow. Everyone's interested in your story and the story of human beings. So I would just tell people that's a way to do it.
Yeah.
And one side note, this is interesting. So like I said, I think I've wanted to do this for 20 years and have not been faithful. And then 2 years ago, I'm like, I'm going to do it. And then this year, I've got to do this. I sat down to do it recently. And this is an interesting, and out popped a book. But it's really that same thing, because it's a little bit of my story, but it's just a very clear, intense presentation of the gospel with my story woven in there. So it's I'm going to do the same thing. It's just like, could I leave this with you? This is my story. And so I urge people to do that, because anybody can do that. And you don't need a booklet, because you can just really say, especially if you have more time, can I tell you my story? Because it's just my story, that's what you're saying to people. And so it doesn't necessarily mean anything for you, but, so and that's evangelism, really. It's God. Yeah. I was this, and then I discovered God, and I saw that he was that. I found him, and he changed my life in this way. It doesn't take a lot.
Yeah. And I think we can even use our present stories too, where not just our conversion stories, but like, that's right, my marriage was a mess. And we, God brought us to this, he met us in this, he gave me this insight, or he softened my heart, or the other thing, which that's making me remind me of something I wanted to say earlier when we're talking about when God invites us to speak to someone else, or when we are dialoguing with someone else. What if we were to say, Lord, help me to see this person as you do?
Oh, that's powerful. Yeah. Gosh.
Yeah. And I think our compassion would, and I think too, the other thing we don't like to talk about, and hopefully I won't offend you by saying this.
I doubt it. That's pretty hard to offend.
But I believe hell is real.
Yeah. Heck yeah.
And that I cannot fathom anybody landing in that place.
No. So you'll do what you can.
I'll do what I can.
That's what you're saying, right? I'll do what I can.
Yeah. And for as long as I can. Like, there are some people in my life I will continue to pray and I think we can ask God to increase our passion for humanity too, our love for humanity.
Yeah, because our natural inclination is to live for ourselves, and there's no shame in that. Look, you're a human being, and especially you're a Western human being. You think about the contrast with that El Salvador pastor. So much of the world is like that. They're connected. They have community. Yeah, I always say, think about America. Who settled in America? Those who left everybody behind, who wanted to chase the brass ring. And they were willing to cut off the relationships. That's who we are. Yeah. And then look what we have in terms of community. It's terrible. And if you haven't been out of the country, you don't necessarily know. But oh my gosh.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're training our kids. Like, we have them in so many sports activities that they don't have family. And so how can they have devotions if we're just running through the drive-through, and they're not building the connections in church so I mean, it's just this cycle. And the other thing I think is that's on my heart that frustrates me. I actually think in a Western context, a lot of our churches, we teach people not to listen to the Spirit and to be people pleasers. And we do it to our volunteers. Like we pressure people into, and we have these really complex programs that will take like 10 volunteers to do like this production outlet portion, that those 10 volunteers could be mobilized to be building relationships. So, I mean, I think it's, I recognize,
but how nearsighted for the church?
Right.
Because you're just thinking of, it's really just self-absorption in a certain way. So first of all, the organization has to run, but I think it's a reflection of self-absorption from the church point of view. We need these needs met, and that's the biggest need. I haven't heard this before, but I'm like, what you're saying is like dead on.
Yeah. Well, and I actually think too, what many of us want is a simplified. Like I look at that one church in Southern California where I grew so much, and I remember I was in children's ministry, and I would have hand-drawn pictures because we didn't have PowerPoint and all this stuff, and it was just a really precious, sweet time. And people could come. One thing that was really beautiful about that church, again, it was in Southern California. And so you would have like somebody sitting right next to you who looked like they were gangbang, right? Like, I mean, they would have all the tattoos and all the jewelry, and they were comfortable showing up. It was because it wasn't so like, I've been to churches where they're so big and so production like a big theater. And we had a young man that lived with us for a while, and one church we went to where it was very production style, and he was terrified. And he once he just peeked in the sanctuary, and it's just too much for him. Whereas like sitting in our living room talking about Jesus, like he was okay with that. So I think we think people want this really fancy experience. Really, they just want authenticity, and they want to experience Jesus.
It's almost like the experience is geared towards the believer. I think it is. And it's geared towards, stealing sheep. That's not the motivation, but you want to be excellent would be another way to say it. But it's really pointed towards the believer, because church can be boring and you're doing it all the time. And so, higher production value is great, but what does the lost feel? Because what are they looking for? They're looking for the signs of life, for something authentic and deep, and oftentimes even quiet, maybe. So with all the razzle dazzle, it doesn't feel any of those things, right? Right.
Well, and are we training in increasing the mentality of Christ followers that they are the center of the world when we are catering everything?
We are. Yeah, unfortunately we are, I think.
Yeah.
Well, listen, I could do another hour or two of this, so we'll have to do it another time. But it has been such a pleasure to talk to you. And this is just where I like it. I mean, my podcast has a couple lanes, which I said to you, it's persecution, religious freedom. But my heartbeat, it's deep Christianity. And so it's what a pleasure it was to meet you and to talk to you about all these things. And hopefully it blesses people. So
yeah, well, it was a blessing to me. So thank you. I appreciate it. And I've enjoyed our conversation as well.
All right. Well, stick around for a second. I'm going to ask you a question or two. But everybody, thanks so much for being on the podcast or coming to the podcast. God bless.
Life Audio.